Welcome to Excelsior 32, the online news source for the Excelsior Project from the New York Council of Deliberation.
Illustrious Powell. I'd like to welcome everybody to Excelsior 32, the online news source for the Excelsior Project from the New York Council of Deliberation, ancient accepted Scottish Rite, Northern Masonic jurisdiction. The experiences, comments, opinions, and views shared on this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not necessarily reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, concordant, or appendant body. Brother Anthony is a past master of Abraham C. Treichler Lodge No. 682 of Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. In 2018, Brother Seth was honored with the Grand Master's Outstanding Service Medal for his work with the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, where he currently serves on several committees and as secretary of the Pennsylvania Academy of Masonic Knowledge. He was honored with the Knight York Cross of Honor for his leadership in the York Rite and is a past Most Wise Master of Francis Marion Hiley Chapter, Knights of Rose Croix of the Valley of Reading, AASRNMJ. Seth was named one of the first 4 Art-grade academics of the Northern Masonic jurisdiction for his research into the spread of clandestine Freemasonry in Pennsylvania in the late 1800s. An avid fraternalist, Brother Anthony is a member of more than 30 fraternal organizations, holding various leadership positions in many of them, including sitting on the board of directors of both the J.H. Rathbone Museum and the Historical Society for American Fraternalism. He's an avid collector of fraternal materials and is best known for the Museum of Fezology, a website devoted to celebrating the history and cultural implications of the small felt tasseled hats. The site features items from Seth's own extensive collection of fezzes, from the apparel of the American woodmen to the Masonic White Shrine of Jerusalem. Seth's other collecting interests include banners, jewels, and ephemera related to fraternal organizations that are less well known. He is a frequent guest speaker for fraternal podcasts and events, and Seth has been published in the Journal of Masonic Society, the Knight Templar Magazine, the Freemasons Victoria, and others. And he co-edited the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania Free and Accepted Masons' newest edition of the Exemplar, A Guide to Masons' Actions. Seth holds membership in more than 30 fraternal organizations, serving many as an officer. Outside of the craft, Seth is employed as Chief of Staff for LW Consulting, a risk management and compliance firm, serving the healthcare space. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Edinburgh University, where he majored in psychology, specializing in learning processes. Later, he earned a Master's of Science degree from Capella University, majoring in organizational management with a focus on human resources. Please join me in welcoming Brother Seth Anthony.
Well, thanks, everybody. Let me get this shared away here. That work? Everybody good? Yeah, all right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Peter, and thank you, Bob and team, for having me tonight. You know, I've redone this first slide many times, and I keep coming back to this picture of the African-American gentleman. I'm pretty sure I've seen Bob make that exact face with some Demolakids around at some point. So it's one of my favorite parts of this presentation now. It's such a fun photo. Tonight, we're gonna talk about what modern Freemasons can learn from failed fraternal organizations. And there's going to be a highlight of the Independent Order of Oddfellows in this, of which I know there are some other members on this call, but we're going to talk about lots of other fraternal groups. As they noted, if you have questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll answer as we can go along here. All right. So why dead organizations matter? So you're sitting here on a Scottish Rite call on a Thursday night saying, I'm a Freemason. These groups are dead. Why should I even care? And really, it's a study in sociology of how these organizations were developed, grew, and then eventually had issues and failed. And there's a lot of things we can learn from the history of these groups to sort of prevent repeating it ourselves or falling into the same traps, and seeing how things that we've thought about trying in Freemasonry have been tried in some of these other groups and may or may not have worked. I started in fraternal organizations, both as a Freemason and later as an Odd Fellow. My grandfather was very involved in Odd Fellowship. He had passed away before I was born, so this was kind of my one fraternal link to him. So I've always been drawn to comparing those two organizations specifically and really recognizing that the Odd Fellows group as it stands today is probably 20 to 40 years ahead of where we are in decline in membership and challenges that we're facing with our organization. So I think there's a lot of parallels we can draw from. But before we can do that, we need to understand a little bit of the history and where these groups come from and why they've been so important to America and our social fabric. So what do we do on Thursdays, right? We go to lodge. Especially in the late 1800s, there wasn't anything else to do. You didn't have a radio, you didn't have a TV. Much of your entertainment outside of what you had to do for work, what was about the social fabric of the community. There just wasn't anything to do at home. You read a book, you had your family around, but if you wanted some social life, you had to get out and go do something. So lodge really became, all these lodges really became the center of communities in the United States. And whether that was a Masonic lodge, whether that was the Knights of Pythias, the Oddfellows, the Eagles, the Moose, the Elks, we're going to touch on all of those. These are the things that brought folks together. And if you think about it, even beyond just the lodge experience, all of these folks went to different churches. They might have been at different faith backgrounds. The lodges were the places where they got together and decided how they were going to handle the issues facing the community. Sure, they had their political meetings, you had your town council and those things, but these were the organizations, as you all know, where the movers and shakers met and sort of hashed out what was going to happen. Just like today, things happen at the bar before and after the meeting, and the meeting's really just the stamp on making sure things get done. So without these organizations, we wouldn't have the world we do today. The other thing we have to keep in mind is a lot of this drastically changes in the 19 teens and early 1920s. So we talk a lot about the golden age of fraternalism, the late 1800s, generally stretching post-Civil War, but really the 1880s up until the mid-1920s, pre-Depression. That's our golden age of fraternalism. That's also when radios and other entertainment starts to come in, but it's really about social policy more than anything else. In 1913, some really important stuff starts to happen, and that's the establishment of the 16th Amendment, which provides for a national income tax to fund the federal government. And that bleeds into World War I and starts to cover some of our costs in the war. But also the government starts to realize that it's getting this money in, and with the ability to tax the citizenry, it can start doing more things and taking on a different role in society. So that really starts to bleed over into the 30s and 40s, touch on here in a second. So the place that the fraternal group starts to change, the social structure starts to change, the government and the socialized systems start to change, and that really leads to the decline of the golden age into the 1920s. I know Bob will very much appreciate the next slide. Thanks, FDR. Lodges weren't just for socializing. They provided you with a social safety net. But ironically, FDR, as one of our most fraternal presidents in history, was a member of many fraternal organizations, a member of the Grand Lodge of New York, Scottish Rite New York. It was his New Deal era programs that did the most to really impact fraternalism and start to change what it did in the community. And a lot of that ties back to the Social Security Act of 1935. Prior to 1935, much of the things that happened in those organizations that, I'm just making sure there, thanks Bob for FDR, much of the social impact that Social Security Act had happened in fraternal organizations. That's where you had a death benefit, that's where you had workers' comp benefits, that's where you had some social safety net. He took all of those good things he learned about in fraternalism and made them government programs. So again, while he was a great fraternalist as a president, seen here wearing a red men's headdress, by the way, and we see a red men's sash over here, it was really the social safety net programs developed by FDR that changed fraternalism and drove it in a different direction from what we know. I also like to touch on this slide in reference to our Masonic youth groups, because when we think about those groups, DeMolay, Rainbow, and Job's Daughters, they really all grew out of being a social safety net for kids who weren't getting opportunities otherwise. They existed in a space that was parents after World War I, where dad might have passed away in the war. They weren't getting opportunities in schools because schools didn't always have a school play and 800 after school curriculars and activities. That again starts to change in the 30s, the 40s, and certainly into the 50s and 60s, where schools start to take on more of that social safety net role and become more involved in taking that community organization bit away. So post depression, the world starts to change for these orders, and that's where we start seeing some of the decline. But before we dig into the decline, let's talk a little bit about what did this look like at the height of the golden age of fraternalism. So there's a fantastic book that you can go out on Amazon and buy. It's about $25. It's a reprint. It's called The Cyclopedia of Fraternities. It's several hundred pages long. And a guy named Albert Stevens, at the time in the early 1900s, tried to survey the landscape of all fraternal organizations and document all of the organizations that existed. Again, the book is several hundred pages. There was a lot. If you look at this little chart, it shows you what were the biggest fraternal organizations in 1907. The Freemasons, obviously fairly large. The Independent Order of Oddfellows, kind of the number 2 guy in 1907, and that will change. The Order of Foresters. And then we have some others, the Independent Order of Good Templars, which was really a temperance society in disguise. The Grand United Order of Oddfellows, which essentially served the same function as Prince Hall to Masonry. The Grand United Order of Oddfellows is that for the Odd Fellowship. The Independent Order of Rechabites, which was another temperance society. The Hibernians, an Irish organization, more temperance. The United Ancient Order of Druids, and B'nai B'rith, which was the Jewish order. Over on the left here, we have some numbers. In 1907, the Order of Eagles had 250,000 members. The Tribe of Ben-Hur, a rather unique fraternal organization, just written based on a book that was popular, 92,000 members. The Foresters, you can see the numbers here. Of all of these groups, only 2 still exist in any fraternal fashion, and that's the Order of the Eagles and the Order of the Hibernians. All of these other groups are extinct or have turned into insurance companies with a name related. You can still go buy Foresters Insurance today, but they have nothing to do with the fraternal organization. But when you stop to think that in 1907, 250,000 people in the United States were members of the Independent Order of Foresters, or 163,000 Junior Order of United American Mechanics. Those are impressive numbers, especially for the time when you didn't have the internet, when you didn't have some of the communications tools we have. These were not small groups. They were major players in the community that were deciding how things work in the social fabric of America. If we look at Freemasonry specifically from that book, from the 1907 book by Stevens, we get some ideas of how large Freemasonry is. So Grand Lodge totals, all U.S. lodges in 1907, he estimated at 1.65 million Masons in the United States. He estimated that Royal Arch Chapter Masons was about 343,000, and Commandery members of the Knights Templar was about 170,000. Give you some ideas. I'm using Pennsylvania as an example because it's what I am most familiar with. So at that time, Pennsylvania Masonic Lodge membership was just under 65,000. Our Royal Arch chapters were about 27,000, and our commanderies were at 17,683. Today, and these are relatively new numbers, Masonic lodges in Pennsylvania are at 74,000. We're about 5,000 chapter members and about 3,000 in commandery. So I look at these numbers and I'm intrigued because we have more Masons today than we did back in 1907. That's a good thing. Even though we're feeling some pinch from shrinking membership numbers, we're still above where we were in 1907. But the density of membership in some of these other organizations is much different than it was then. So I think that has a telling number on where we see ourselves in Freemasonry and kind of the involvement. People aren't as deep into involvement as they might have been. You'll notice here, I did add this in about the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite. It estimates about 125,000 members in 1907. That's both the northern and the southern jurisdiction at that point. But remember, this is really when the Scottish Rite was just gearing up. This is prime post-Pike time and coming out of Pike. And this is when the Scottish Rite really starts to grow, again, because it's an entertainment venue with the theater and the degrees being performed. A very different experience than what folks were seeing in chapter council and commandery. Stepping from that to talk about the Independent Order of Odd Fellows as our case study. We've talked about where Freemasonry was, kind of sizes, and looking at the Odd Fellows as an example organization. I don't think it had it on one of these other ones. So sorry, I'm just jumping between slides. In 1907, I thought I had it on here, I do not. Odd Fellowship was growing and ended with about 800,000 members nationally, and in a single organization. They were by far the largest single organization of fraternal orders in the United States at the time that they were really operational. That's important because of the way the Odd Fellows are structured, and that's going to draw some parallels to why they might not be doing so well today. But first, let's talk about similarities, kind of where we're at. Both Freemasonry and Odd Fellowship started as fraternities with relatively unknown origins. The Odd Fellows were thought to be groups of odd tradesmen or people from trades that did not have a union. So stonemasons were stonemasons, and there were carpenters and fletchers and all of these groups. The Odd Fellows were the odd men out, like the chimney sweeps or the lantern salesman, things like that. They banded together to form this kind of imperfect union of other trades. Both sought to teach moral lessons. Odd Fellows, friendship, love, and truth versus brotherly love, relief, and truth that we often see in Freemasonry, obviously very similar. Both organizations are charitable with a strong focus on community involvement. Both groups have a constellation of affiliated bodies. We're going to talk about some of those. So things you can join after you join Odd Fellowship. Both groups have a very strong international presence that exists outside of the United States in different ways. And both groups had a predominantly African-American alternative. So we also see a division there along lines in the late 1800s, early 1900s that drove some of the traditions that we see today. Where they diverged, and I just realized my graphic here is in the way, I apologize, but I will read through that. The difference here, the Odd Fellows have a national organization called the Sovereign Grand Lodge. So whereas Freemasonry, we have our 50 independent jurisdictions in the United States, or 51 with DC, plus our Prince Hall Grand Lodges, all of those things. The Odd Fellows, as an independent order of Odd Fellows, have one national Grand Lodge, which means there is one national Grand Master of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. There are state-level Grand Masters that all report up, but there's a very large superstructure at the top that's governing this order from the top down. Historically, the Odd Fellows were far more democratic. They would allow elections not just at the local lodge level, but at the district level. You would vote for your district deputy Grand Master, vote for your Grand Master, vote for your representatives in the Grand Lodge and the Sovereign Grand Lodge. Just a very different system than we see in Freemasonry, which has a much more patriarchal or parochial way of handling things. The Odd Fellows were traditionally much more blue collar. As I talk about fraternal groups, there's sort of a three-tier system. The Odd Fellows were generally blue collar. Certainly there were attorneys and prominent members of society who were involved, don't get me wrong. But across the board, they tended to be more rural, smaller lodges, and more blue collar. The Knights of Pythias tended to be the middle class of lodges. They were often the merchants, the storekeepers, the local townsfolk. And Freemasonry took a very white collar role. It was the management, it was the attorneys and the doctors and the folks in town that were Freemasons. Freemasonry was also generally more expensive to belong to put a little bit of a touchstone for you. The Odd Fellows historically were targeted less by ecclesiastical authorities. The churches didn't have as many issues with the Odd Fellows for a variety of reasons, mostly because they flew under the radar compared to the Freemasons. Certainly they've had questions in the past, but they didn't experience that kind of backlash that we've seen in Freemasonry. And really importantly, in the year 2000, the Odd Fellows adopted a gender-neutral membership. So both women and men can be members of the Odd Fellows starting in the year 2000. They crossed that Rubicon. So that's going to give us some insight as to where they are at today as we think through the organization. If you look at the Odd Fellows then and now, you're going to see some very different takes here. The fellows here on the left looking very dapper in their bow ties and their sashes. The thing I would draw your attention to, while this looks like a very dapper, nice picture, you can kind of see that here's the roof of the building. They've set up a backdrop. So these guys are wearing their best clothes. This is their best night out to go to lodge. And it's probably a pretty small lodge in the scheme of things with this backdrop and whatnot set up. Kind of speaks to the blue collar nature that they had. Oftentimes their jewels and their regalia, while very fancifully embroidered, you don't see a lot of gold. You don't see a lot of silver, precious metals. They relied very heavily on fancy embroidery because that was just frankly much more cost effective for them. On the right, we have Odd Fellows today, so you'll notice a mix of men and women. You'll see a lot of blue jeans in there. Obviously no tie. There's still some regalia hung up around the room, but it's become really kind of leaned into that blue collar roots in a lot of places, not everywhere. But this is kind of the difference of the order then versus now. So what's so odd about these guys? They seem like a pretty stand-up lot. Here we can see some chain collars. So we do see a little bit of metal, but these are probably Grand Lodge officers. So this is a step up in the order, looking a little bit fancier. As I noted, they were the guys engaged in the odd trades. So they were not stonemasons, carpenters, those things, but the odd trades banded together. The earliest records show them coming together around 1730. And then we start to see a real 1748 timeframe. We start to see real records and lodges and things happening. So sort of like Masonry, where we've got some sparse records in the late 1600s, early 1700s, they tend to be early 1700s to mid 1700s in their organizational state. And it all started in England, just like Freemasonry. So obviously some ties there where we come from and where we're going. The Odd Fellows came to the United States in 1819 as part of the immigration that came over from England, and we're going to touch on that here in a minute. But I think you'll agree with me that it certainly sounds a lot like Freemasonry. Started in England, trade guild, don't have a lot of early records, banded together for mutual improvement. Specifically, the Odd Fellows visited the sick, buried the dead, relieved the distress, and educated the orphan. Now, it sounds very Masonic. They have degrees, they have structure, they have regalia. Very similar organizations. So in 1813, a lodge was started in Baltimore as part of an English lodge known today as the Manchester Unity. That would basically be their version of the United Grand Lodge of England. But like anything, we're Americans, damn it. We don't want to be part of England. We broke away and changed the name to the Independent Order of Odd Fellows and started a sovereign Grand Lodge. Again, very similar to Freemasonry. Lodges came over from England. They were established under English authority and then decided to break free and form their own organization. The guy behind that was named Thomas Wilby, known for his brains, not for his looks. You see him here painted in an idealistic younger manner, and then a more accurate photo from his older days. He joined the Odd Fellows in 1804 in England, and then when he moved to Baltimore, decided he wanted to bring the organization here, specifically related to folks being unemployed and out of work. He saw how in England, the Odd Fellows helped people find work. So there's a labor element there as well, especially in the United States. Wilby had an outgoing personality, and he was just a firebrand of, I'm going to organize people and get people together to start an Odd Fellows Lodge here in the States. He did what any good man in the early 1800s would do. He put an ad in the newspaper and said, hey, if you're an Odd Fellow and you live in Baltimore, we should meet at the Seven Stars Inn and see about forming a lodge. Again, kind of a tie to Freemasonry. They started in a tavern, brought guys together, had a lodge in a tavern that formed. So his advertisement worked. He starts bringing guys together and creates this independent order of Odd Fellows in America with the similar philanthropic goals to their English cousins. And he starts forming lodges up and down the eastern seaboard because Baltimore is a shipping harbor at that point in the United States. He's able to export the idea of an Odd Fellows Lodge easily, especially along the trade routes, and the order starts to grow and rapidly catches on, much like Freemasonry was doing in the early 1800s. The other thing we have to remember in relation to the Odd Fellows is they didn't have an anti-Masonic period. So we get pegged in the late 1820s into the 1840s with the anti-Masonic period. That never happened to the Odd Fellows. So they got a chance to grow and thrive for a period of 20 or 25 years where Freemasonry really lied dormant. And they definitely benefited from a quiet Freemasonry in growing their organization. The membership requirements were very similar to what we've seen in Freemasonry. Male, belief in a supreme being. Again, generally lower to middle class members, not saying that that was exclusive, but in general. Because a lot of what they brought to the table was the social safety net. That was appealing. To this day, my Odd Fellows Lodge still offers me a $500 death benefit if a close family member dies, or if I die, they provide $500 to my family member. I don't think that has changed since the 1960s. The $500 was much more impactful back then, but that was a big part of Odd Fellowship, was that social safety net, certainly more so than Freemasonry. The Odd Fellows also got much more into the idea of fraternal insurance. And while they didn't have an insurance arm per se, there was a lot of affiliated organizations with Odd Fellowship that did. Freemasonry, by and large, steered clear of the insurance game, which I think is impactful in the long run as to where the organizations come together and historically why one has done better than the other. Staying out of insurance was probably a good bet for Freemasonry in the long run. Degrees, very similar. Again, much more like chapter and council degrees. If you're a member of chapter or council, not necessarily the stage degrees of Scottish Rite. They tell classic Old Testament biblical stories, story of the Good Samaritan, David and Jonathan, Aaron the high priest. There are 3 degrees except not. There's 4. There's an initiatory degree, kind of a 0 degree, and then a first, second, and third degree of friendship, love, and truth. Masonic historians might tie this together somewhat like Freemasonry, where there's a first, second, and third degree, but also the Holy Royal Arch. And if you're familiar with how the Grand Lodge of England views Freemasonry, they really view the Holy Royal Arch as an important piece of the third degree. So while we say there's 3 degrees, there's sort of 4. Odd Fellowship, very similar in that, and that it's got an initiatory degree and then 3 beyond that. Oh, and I should note that you are not considered a full member of the Odd Fellows until you have your 4 degrees, very similar to some Masonic jurisdictions where you had to have your Master Mason degree to vote or do other things. This is where we start talking a little bit about differences, though. So who's in charge? With great collars come great responsibilities. The bigger and fancier your collar, generally the higher up the food chain you are. So a lodge is led by a noble grand and a vice grand. So similar to a worshipful master, senior warden, junior warden situation, it is a line of officers. They have district deputy grandmasters, just like most lodges. Again, though, they are often elected versus appointed. There's a sovereign grandmaster. That's who this fella is from several years ago. He's the national head, the sovereign grandmaster of the whole United States. But all branches of the Odd Fellowship, and they refer to all these side orders as a branch, they're all subservient to the Sovereign Grand Lodge. So you almost want to think of it like the United States and how the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Very similarly, the Sovereign Grand Master is considered the head of the Patriarchs Militant, the Knight Templar type body within the Odd Fellows. They're all subservient to this Sovereign Grand Lodge leadership. So a very different structure nationally than what we see in Freemasonry. And again, much more democratic. We don't want to leave the wives out, hide your wives and daughters, or they might end up at lodge with you. The Odd Fellows were really the trailblazers here. The Rebecca degree, named after the biblical character of Rebecca, was written in 1851 by future Vice President of the United States, Schuyler Colfax. Really, the Rebecca degree broke ground to have a separate fraternal order for women that was affiliated to a men's order. It's the precursor of the Order of the Eastern Star in a lot of ways. What Eastern Star did is very much modeled on Rebecca, and McCoy and Morris knew about the Rebecca Order and drew heavily from how it was organized. A very similar system. Those groups grow by leaps and bounds nationally, both the Rebeccas and the Odd Fellows. till they really do eclipse Freemasonry in total national membership at more than 800,000 members of the Sovereign Grand Lodge. So when you think about trying to govern 800,000 members, that is just crazy, right? Yeah, we can barely govern our individual states in Freemasonry a lot of times, let alone trying to govern an entire country. I also talk about when you're trying to govern an organization of that size with very different cultures, especially in the early to mid 1900s, how often do you think the Grand Lodge of Oddfellows of Alabama agreed with the Grand Lodge of Oddfellows of Massachusetts or Washington State or California or Florida? Everything was a national legislative session. I'm from here in Pennsylvania. I can't get Pittsburgh and Philadelphia to agree on stuff at times, let alone trying to get Mobile to agree with Boston. A very different organization to try to manage nationally. Of course, as I noted, they have all of those other degrees that are out there, much like Freemasonry, and they influence each other back and forth. Freemasonry develops some degrees, and the Oddfellows then develop something similar, and the Oddfellows will develop some degrees, and Freemasonry will develop something similar. They feed off of each other in a lot of ways. There's several small groups internally. The encampment of patriarchs within Odd Fellowship is very much like a chapter of Royal Archmasons. We've talked about the cantons of patriarchs militant, their version of Knight Templary. The uniforms look very similar, very fancy. You saw some of those on earlier slides. There's the ancient mystic order of Samaritans, which is their version of the Shriners. There was almost a 1-for-1 in every one of these organizations. And of course, there was rogue orders and degrees as well. Things that started, were created, did well for a few years and died, merged, separated, all the crazy stuff you see in Freemasonry. It all happened in Oddfellows as well, just in a different scale and a different time. The interesting thing with the Oddfellows is that buildings were not the thing they were often interested in creating. Freemasonry, because we're builders by trade, we like to build big, fancy, fraternal, special built clubhouses. The Oddfellows had some of that, but it was nowhere near what Freemasonry did, especially in the teens and 20s. The building you see here is actually the current national headquarters of the Oddfellows, and Sovereign Grand Lodge meets at this very small building in the 200 block of Trade Street in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Why is it in Winston-Salem? Because that's where the Grand Secretary lived when they decided to move the building. They were much more interested, however, in building large retirement communities and orphanages. You'll find a lot of Oddfellow charitable groups, the retirement groups and the orphanages around the country. Some are still open, many have closed. You just don't see the grandiose, big purpose-built buildings that you see in Freemasonry. So, kind of depressing that they don't have the big buildings, and we talk about where they're at today. So early 1900s, 800,000 members. Today, the largest Grand Lodge in all of Oddfellows is the Grand Lodge of California, with about 3,500 members for the entire state of California. Pennsylvania has about 2,000 members. We're the second or third largest Grand Lodge in Oddfellowship. The organization has just shrunk dramatically. And a lot of that I attribute to some of these governmental challenges and how they're organized and structured. Very hard to govern a national organization and get folks to agree. They tried the Rubicon of admitting women. And that's kind of been a bugaboo in Freemasonry for years about, well, would women make the organization better? It didn't help Oddfellows. There's certainly women in the organization, but they're nowhere near a majority. They're still very much a minority. And it didn't change their membership numbers all that dramatically. This is a beautiful building in Carlisle, Pennsylvania that was a special built Oddfellows temple that you see is in very rough shape. And we've seen Masonic lodges look very similar to this lodge, where they're beautiful paintings on the wall, and unfortunately they're just crumbling. So you start to think about this organization that was once bigger than Freemasonry, had all the trappings of Freemasonry, thousands of lodges, a constellation of appendant bodies, all of those things, and yet it's compared to Freemasonry, it's a fraction, very small compared to where we were. Here in Pennsylvania, we've got about 80 Oddfellows lodges. So you think about 80 lodges with approximately 2,000 members in them. All of these little side organizations still exist. They're just very, very small. You don't have big appendant bodies like we do in the Masonic order. Even a Scottish Rite Valley of 100 or 150 dwarfs some of even the biggest encampments of patriarchs, and certainly the cantons and these other groups. Nationally, their version of the Shriners, the ancient mystic order of Samaritans, has less than 300 members in 25 chapters. So it still exists. They're still out there, very, very small. Their commandery branch, the Canton of Patriarchs, instead of having state level jurisdictions like they used to, now have multi-state jurisdictions. So, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York might be all grouped together and have one guy in charge of 3 states because there's only 2 chapters left in each state. Still exists, very different way of governing. Interestingly, though, the Oddfellows are still very active internationally and have a very different milieu than what we have here in the United States. Here we see some Oddfellows in Northern Europe, where the organization is still very strong. And look at the difference compared to what we saw in some of those earlier slides. Everybody's in a suit, and not just a suit, but white tie in several cases. Very nice regalia, very well pressed, very well dressed, and the organization there is actually much more like Freemasonry in having some higher standards of just regular meetings and what they look like, and taking time to get through those degrees and be participatory in your lodge. You don't just get to go join a bunch of things. You get in your lodge, you spend some time, you advance. It's a lifetime commitment for Odd Fellowship there. Very different from the United States, but not dissimilar to Freemasonry in the United States in a lot of ways. So I find that contrast interesting when we look at how these organizations have emerged. All of that to say, what does this have to do with the Scottish Rite and Freemasonry, and what can we learn from it? These guys are 3 old Oddfellows members of a lodge in Texas, and I bet you if you looked around your Masonic lodge, you'd probably see some guys who meet this same kind of look and feel. The Oddfellows are 20 to 40 years ahead of us in membership trends. Their membership has crashed. They are now really struggling from a membership standpoint. So what do you do if there's only 2,000 Masons left in the entire state of New York? What does that look like? What does that mean for the Scottish Rite? How do all these other bodies that we love fit in? It makes a very different outlook on fraternalism as an organization. And we look back and say, well, what did they do compared to Freemasonry that brings them to where they're at today? They tried admitting women, didn't necessarily work. They had a very much more democratic system, didn't necessarily work for them. They had a national Grand Lodge with very strong national leadership, didn't necessarily work for them. And they had a very strong focus on charitable outreach and spending money on charity, didn't necessarily work for them. So things we hear in Freemasonry that often folks say, if we just concentrated on this, or if we just had that, it would help. They've tried a lot of these things and it hasn't helped. Not saying it couldn't work locally in some places, but from is it something we should try? Here's a great example of a group that has tried a lot of these things and it's not worked for them. And if we don't figure something out, we're going to become in that same boat very quickly. And that's a scary thing for all of us to think about for a fraternity we love and an organization we love. With that, I just want to make one final plug here, and then we'll take some questions. I work with a group called the Center for Fraternal Collections and Research at Indiana University, and that's in the state of Indiana in Bloomington. Go Hoosiers. I am not an alumni, but I'm very supportive. And that's where Dr. Heather Calloway is from as the archivist. And our goal as an organization is to save the history of these fraternal organizations, the Oddfellows, the Knights of Pythias, all of these groups beyond Freemasonry that really were the fabric of American society, that don't benefit from a Chancellor Robert R. Livingston Library and Museum, or a House of the Temple, or a Lexington, Massachusetts that's saving these things. We're trying to band together and have a national repository where we can save some of this history. If you're interested in what we're doing, you can check us out on the website there, or if you just search IU Fraternal Center, it'll be the first link that pops up. We'd love to have you check us out. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes left in the hour, and I can answer questions and we can have a discussion. I will stop sharing my screen. There we go.
So Seth, right now we have no questions in the chat. Eric Stott said the Oddfellows home in Worcester, Mass, was like a Victorian mansion. Unfortunately, it's been torn down. So that kind of
Not uncommon.
Yeah, falls right in line with what you're saying. So does anyone have any questions for Seth?
Or
guys,
thoughts?
you can probably
Yeah.
turn your cameras on now too if you
Yep.
you want.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Myron.
Myron Deputat from Buffalo, New York. And so it seems, at least from what you've described to us, the Oddfellows have tried all of these things of trying to keep everything going as best they could in the guise of a large organization. And today, I mean, let's face it, today people have so many more avenues for their entertainment and for things to do. So they don't necessarily have to belong to a fraternal organization or anything like this. And also, and you brought this up briefly, that a lot of these fraternal organizations had things to do with insurance. And today they're insurance companies, but back then that was about the only way an individual could get insurance or some type of disaster support was by joining a fraternal organization, because insurance companies as we know them today did not exist. So there were many reasons for belonging to a lodge. I often ask, do we really know? There's a what is the why of belonging to a fraternal organization, or any organization for that matter? And what was the why? What is currently the why for the Oddfellows? Why would someone today be interested in joining something like that?
Great question. and where the Oddfellows are seeing some success today, because I should add that they are seeing success in some limited pockets. And what they're seeing success in is being the welcoming organization for everybody. And by that, I mean Freemasonry, we only have men. But by nature, it's only guys. They're saying, we don't care if you're male or female or however you identify. Come on in. We're a fraternal experience for everybody. And that has been very successful in specific pockets around the country. They've also attracted kind of a crowd that is still very blue collar, but I would say, I don't want to use this term pejoratively, but alternative lifestyle. There's a lodge in Texas that is bikers. And so it's, we have widow sons and those things, but these are guys that they've turned their Oddfellows Lodge into a bikers organization. And it's working great for them. If you like the tattoo shows, the show Ink Masters on, I think it's TLC or one of those groups, one of the tattoo artists on there's a very prominent Oddfellow in rural Texas, and has been very open about his Oddfellows membership. So it attracts kind of the folks who haven't been given an organization anywhere else in society, or don't feel like they fit in some of these other groups. That's where they're starting to find some success. But all of that comes back to, what are they doing? And they're providing an experience. And I think that's where we would agree, even in Freemasonry, the organizations that are providing a quality membership experience are the ones that are doing well. It's education and experience. Pete's got his hand up.
You have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Seth. A comment and a question. I was recently at the Grand Lodge of England for an event in the province of Cheshire. And the Grand Lodge of England, while not an amity, does recognize the Order of Women Freemasons for them to have their own thing. And it was explained to me by a member of the province that they have their thing and we have ours.
Mhm.
So I think that there is a world where, you know, fraternity and sorority can exist, both having their own independence. And I honestly think they're stronger for it. That's just a comment. My question is, it sounds like the success you're talking about in the Oddfellows is achieved regionally when they address regional issues. Do they have anything that guides them nationally, or is that part of their problem that they don't have, something that speaks nationally?
Great question. So some of the challenges, and you make a great point that they are seeing success regionally. The national challenges, yeah, there's a national constitution and there's national leadership, but just like anything else, by the time you get to be the national sovereign grand master, you've spent decades, working your way through this organization to get up to that level. And those aren't the folks that are driving the new ideas and the new programs nationally. It tends to be these regional folks. And I think that's part of Freemasonry secret sauce, right? We never went to this national group and said, here, National Grandmaster, give me programs and tell me what to do. Each Grand Lodge figured out what worked well for it and what didn't. In some cases, they figured it out sooner and have done really well. In some cases, they've really struggled. But I think that confederation is part of what's made Freemasonry much stronger, is we've had that regional focus, and the Oddfellows are sort of living that experientially, but not governmentally. If that makes sense.
So I'll chime in here. So my family, very similar to yours, Seth, very Masonic, very Oddfellows connected. On our family plot in Brooklyn, New York, on one of the tombstones, right at the top is a Masonic square and compass and the three links of Oddfellows. I'm a past Noble Grand of Washington Irving Lodge up in Saugerties, New York. We have a very, very small lodge, very difficult to recruit people. So I get where you're going. It was interesting when I got my degrees in the Oddfellows, they were on video, they were not done live. All right. I'll be quite honest, compared to, let's say, like a program like Thursday Night at the Right, they were like a home video. I mean,
not even close.
Not even close. Not even close. When you were speaking, I did a little research on my own. There's 760 Oddfellows in the state of New York where I live, and it was interesting when I got my third degree. The second meeting I ever went to, the Grandmaster of New York was there. We started talking about, my background, DeMolay, the whole thing. He was pretty familiar with Freemasonry. And he said to me, well, once you become past Noble Grand, you should really consider running for Grandmaster of the state. That's what he said to me. And I had been in Oddfellows maybe, I don't know, 3 minutes. And here he was already lining me up to be on the state level, which I found pretty amazing. So you're 100% right. I guess my question to you, it's really two questions. Do you think fraternities are suffering more than sororities, or sororities suffering more than fraternities?
Good question. And I know Heather has her camera off, and she happens to be there. Turn your camera on, Heather, because I think you might be a good tie-in for this. It's an interesting question because the sororities always took a different angle. And I know the experience with Amaranth and Eastern Star here in the United States, and they have certainly suffered even more than Freemasonry has. But to compare broadly fraternity, sorority, I would be interested. Heather's got the sorority background that I don't necessarily have, especially on the college level and in some of these community groups. Heather, your thoughts?
Certainly. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. I would say we have not suffered. I would say groups like Eastern Star and some of the affiliated groups have really struggled, but I'm a member of Alpha Chi Omega, which is my college sorority, but I'm active as an alumni and advisor and all kinds of other activities. We have alumni clubs, and they're very active, as well as at different points of women's lives, whether they're kind of right out of college and they're networking for their job, and then they kind of disappear for a while because they have kids, and then they come back and they get really involved again in various ways, whether they're supporting collegians or they're just wanting to connect with women that they have like common interests with. I'm also a member of PEO, and we have 5 or 6 chapters here in Bloomington, Indiana, and this is a town of only 80,000 people, and there's chapters everywhere. and various ages, various times of day that we meet. We mostly meet at people's homes, so we don't have that same burden of a building and all the other trappings that deplete your monetary stuff. So at least in the activities that I've been involved with, and I know other women that are in other groups, it really hasn't suffered in the same way. Now I do worry about some of the Masonic and other fraternal type groups, but we have in my groups we have ritual, we have all the same kind of things that you guys have similarly.
That's interesting.
You don't have men though. Those are straight sororities, correct?
Yeah, they're
So it's not
single
like Eastern
gender,
Star where a man must be present.
which I think is in my opinion, is one of the challenges to that.
Interestingly, and
sorority,
just a
right.
side note, there's a group affiliated to the Odd Fellows called the Ladies of the Orient. Very tiny. There's 4 chapters left, to my knowledge. 2 in California, 1 in Ontario, and maybe 1 in New York. They were essentially the women's auxiliary to their Shriners group. So they were the women's auxiliary to the Ancient Mystic Order of Samaritans, founded in New York. Another fun fact, in central New York, kind of in that fez-wearing time. But they were the first of the women's orders to not require a man to be present. Was the fez-wearing fun group affiliated for women to the Odd Fellows. And unfortunately, they have not survived as well. I don't know what was going on in New York in the late 1890s that people needed to have fun between the Shriners and the Grotto and these other fez-wearing groups. It all seems to have occurred in the middle of nowhere in New York in the 1880s and 1890s. So something in the water at that point.
I live in central New York, and the last few years being the exception, we get a lot of bad weather, especially in the winter. So we're always looking for something that doesn't involve snow. But I would be interested. We've mentioned that there are female-only Masonic groups, but there are also co-ed Masonic groups out there. And just doing a quick glance on the internet at some of them, they seem to be somewhat thriving. I don't know what their numbers are, and they seem to really embrace the esoteric side of Freemasonry a little bit more than the Grand Lodges do. So I was wondering if you have you or Heather, if either of you have any background on any of those organizations.
I'll share that one of my favorite books in Freemasonry, and I can see it on my shelf over here, is called On Holy Ground by Karen Kidd. A fantastic book that explores the history of the co-Masonic movement in the United States, especially in the late 1800s. And a lot of it starts in the coal fields of Western Pennsylvania. It paints a very different view of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania from what we're taught as Pennsylvania Masons. It talks about Pennsylvania judges locking up co-Masons for using the insignia and saying that they're Masons when they weren't Masons. It's, kind of it makes us the villain in a lot of ways, which is a weird thing to feel and see. But they have a fantastic museum in the middle of nowhere in Colorado, a little town called Larkspur outside of Denver. So they're still very active. They have chapters around the country, not as big by any stretch, but the folks who are involved in that are very dedicated to it, and it's a lifetime commitment. And as you noted, much more esoteric in their focus than what we see in our mainstream Grand Lodge.
Right. Yeah, I think
When you say co-Masonry, do you mean meeting together or simply just acknowledging each other's existence?
No, this is meeting together, initiating both men and women. Yep.
Yeah.
In New York City, there are a number of Masonic groups for women only, and there are some that are co-ed. They meet on West 45th Street near 9th Avenue in Manhattan. There's a Grand Lodge there, and they take their Masonry very, very seriously. Excuse me. You only receive 1 degree a year, and in between each degree, you have to write and present a paper before the lodge before you can proceed to the next degree. They're very esoteric and they're very serious about their Masonry. And they would actually run circles around some of our brothers.
Absolutely.
There's your presentation for next year, Seth. What Freemasonry can learn from co-Freemasonry.
That
Seth, I
there
have
is
a
takes on
second
all of it
question.
for sure.
Chance.
Sure, go for it.
I know you're aware in the past that there's been rumbling about, the shrine separating itself from Masonry. With your extensive background in a lot of these organizations, where do you see the connection between Masonry and some of these appendant bodies? Is it only weakening in certain places, or is what's happening in Shrine in the Midwest a harbinger of more things to come?
Interesting question. So, talking about other papers that I someday need to write, I would posit that the 1893 World's Fair was the most important event in the history of Freemasonry in the United States as a singular event, because it was the 1893 World's Fair that brought a lot of international folks to the United States in Chicago, but also made the shrine what it is today. Pardon my dogs in the background, it's dinner time. Made the shrine what it is today. Because that's where the shrine really debuted on the national stage, and they had parades and made a big deal about, look at us as Freemasons coming together at this World's Fair event. In relation to the shrine, it's all about how we harness it and what we use it for as an organization and how it supports Freemasonry. And I would argue that the shrine is the most important public relations piece that we have in Freemasonry. People may not know what a Mason is or what a Grand Lodge, but they know what the shrine is. They know Shriners in their little cars. They have fond memories of parades and hospitals and growing up. And if we were to harness that in the right way and understand it as a great piece of PR, we could do a lot with it. But we also have to work together. And I think that's where some of the challenge has been with the Shrine and some of these other organizations, is instead of working together, we kind of all have our own fiefdoms and our own way of working. And that leads us to some of those cross challenges that we see today.
I've often wondered, picking up on what you just said, if, and I know this has been brought up in the Shrine. I'm a Shriner, and I've heard this, that there are some states, I guess, who want to have Shriners that are not Masons, to make them Shriners, and with the hope that not only does the Shrine membership go up, but it'll give an opportunity for these men to do some great philanthropic work and then potentially become a Freemason. So you're kind of grabbing some low-hanging fruit. I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but you never know. I mean, desperate times call for desperate measures.
I think in our lifetimes we'll see the Shrine break away. That's just my guess, and certainly in my lifetime, and not for any malicious reason, but because Freemasonry continues to shrink and having a second filter on membership is a challenge. And they're going to look and say, if we remove that friction, I'm a marketing guy in my day job. I talk about friction. Where's the friction in the process? What's stopping people from doing something? And if being a member of something else that they can't control nationally and can't have a consistent message on is causing friction, it makes sense for them to try something new. Will it work? I don't know. We've seen in the Odd Fellows that some of that's worked and some of it hasn't. Take that for what you will.
I also think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to offer a small comment. It seems like one of the things, and Seth, you can comment on this afterwards, but to me, it seems like one of the problems that befell groups like the Odd Fellows is that they tried to maintain this structure of a large organization with fewer and fewer members. And so therefore what ends up happening is you end up taxing all those members trying to maintain this infrastructure, which doesn't necessarily need to exist. And I believe that's one of the things we're experiencing in Freemasonry, because if you go to any Masonic district almost anywhere in the country, it's the same people doing the same things in all of the different bodies, whether it's York Rite, Scottish Rite, lodges, district roles. You look and it's the same people, and they're out 4 or 5 nights a week, and it's something that's untenable. And we get away then from the real work of Masonry, which is that, not just the fraternalism, but also the whether it's the deeper knowledge or figuring out what our why is, why we exist as an organization in this modern era. And it's okay to be smaller. The explosion of Freemasonry, you know, really, and all these fraternal orders happened 150 years ago. There were times when these organizations were small and they were secret. And only, it wasn't about quantity, but it was about quality. Unfortunately, today we have such a large infrastructure that we're still trying to support without without weaning some of these things away to make it more manageable so that we can have a rich experience for the members. And I believe we're suffering from, we're basically destroying our own organization by trying to maintain an infrastructure which is untenable. And as a result, it's creating creating something that many new members get involved in, and we have a problem where they don't come back, they don't show up, because suddenly, you know, somebody comes in and within 3 years they're trying to make them master of their lodge, and they haven't even learned what's going on in a lodge, you know. So what do you feel about that, Seth?
Let me play devil's advocate a little bit. You make great points. 100% that we throw guys in and don't give them a chance to really enjoy and curate that experience. This is where I put my hat on as the Grand Secretary of AMD, one of those small, weird, invitational things that draws people away from all this other stuff, right? If you were to go through the rolls of your lodge and look at all the men who demitted voluntarily or were suspended for non-payment of dues, I would be willing to put a good sum of money that those men generally were not involved in any Masonic organization other than their craft lodge. They joined Freemasonry, they joined their craft lodge, they didn't find something that grabbed them and got them involved, and they spoke with their feet. They either stopped paying their dues or they actually demitted from their lodge. It's pretty rare that you see a guy voluntarily leave the fraternity if he's super involved in another organization inside. You don't see Shriners quitting because they know they've got to be a member to go do their Shrine stuff that they love. So I think part of what we are challenged in Freemasonry is finding what a guy likes and giving him more of that. And that's where some of this milieu of other bodies becomes helpful. But to your point, there's so much of it that it can be hard to figure out what that thing is for that individual member. And the challenge we put on our lodges is they have to be everything to everybody in some way. They have to do a little bit of charity, a little bit of social work, a little bit of education, and all of those things at the local lodge level to keep guys interested, so that then we can figure out what they like and move them to Scottish Rite or move them on to these other organizations. But I would argue from a Grand Lodge standpoint, it actually behooves us to have a guy join something other than his craft lodge, because the chances that he's going to demit decrease dramatically if he found something in Freemasonry that he really likes beyond his craft lodge, and maybe we keep him involved there because he found that thing. So just a devil's advocate viewpoint.
So let me strengthen your response. So being a membership guy for Scottish Rite and getting very involved in retention, the Grand Lodge of Ohio, I'm looking at this on a PowerPoint on my other screen, a published report from the Grand Lodge of Ohio shows that a Blue Lodge Scottish Rite Mason versus a Blue Lodge non-Scottish Rite Mason over a 20-year period has a 15% better membership retention rate over the member who stays with his Blue Lodge only. So that answers, you're spot on. And, you know, we had Grand Master Thomas here in New York, and one of the things he used to say, I heard him say it once, I heard him say it 50 times, is though you're all involved in your lodge, don't stay in your lodge. Join the Scottish Rite, join the York Rite, join the Shrine, join whatever you think you're going to like, because you're going to stick with this program. And the longer you stick with that program, you're going to stick with stick being a Mason. And so you're 1,000% correct. And you know, Myron's right. The most active men are the ones that belong to a lot of different organizations. I mean, I talk to Rick all the time, and you know, he'll say, I gotta go, I've got an AMD meeting, or I gotta go, I got a York rally, and I'll say, yeah, I've gotta go get, you know, we're both on the road a lot, but we're doing things we like. And it's still Masonic for 100%. So you draw a great point there.
Yeah, so it is challenging to keep that milieu of bodies, but if it's serving the purpose of keeping men engaged, there's value in it. I think where the Oddfellows ran into the problem was it wasn't keeping men engaged.
Yeah.
And now they're still trying to support these, and the engagement isn't there that they used to have.
Yeah. I also think too, really quickly, to kind of sum all this up, we lose a lot of buildings in Freemasonry, and that bothers me to see these beautiful structures go. But is Commander Samick? Commander Samick, his video's off. But I remember multiple years ago, he came to one of our consistory meetings, and we were talking about the Poughkeepsie Masonic Temple that was being sold. And I remember he said to me, which was profound, and I never forgot this. A building does not make a lodge. The lodge is the men inside the organization. That's what makes the lodge great, not the building. And
100%.
what I'm starting to wonder now is, as other organizations are getting smaller, Freemasonry is getting smaller, or right sizing, depending on how you want to look at it. I wonder if you're going to see more fraternal buildings, where one building, a grand building, doesn't have to be gigantic, but you might see an Elks Lodge, you might see a Moose Lodge, you might see a Masonic Lodge, all in the same building, sharing the cost, sharing the burden of keeping property up, but also enjoying fraternalism amongst each organization. I think there's a lot of value in that, and I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if you see that in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure.
We see some of that. There's certainly many Oddfellows lodges that share. The largest Oddfellows lodge in Pennsylvania meets the Greater Pittsburgh Masonic Center. That's where they've met for years at this point. So I think you're going to see some of that, but it's a return to where we were, right? This
Right.
was the way it was 150 years ago. Everybody shared a building because nobody had enough money to have one giant building that was just theirs for their purpose-built thing. We all shared buildings. So what's old is new again, and vice versa, as it's always been.
True.
I think what kills a lot of Masonic lodges is the members are so busy trying to keep the building open, that eventually they just get tired and they give it up. They give up the building, they give up their membership. I did not become a Freemason to do chicken dinners. And I don't know if anybody here tonight joined Freemasonry for doing something like that. So is the building more important than the brotherhood? I don't think so. It's nice to have some of those grand buildings, but we don't need that many.
So you make an interesting point, and my Oddfellows Lodge is in exactly this position, where our building was built in 1886. It's a fantastical building. We have a third floor lodge room with a set of stairs that will kill most men, especially of my size, trying to walk up those. But we have 6 apartments in the building. And when I joined, we spent a 40-minute meeting. We spent 35 minutes talking about the building and the apartments. Who's renting them? Did we get the rent? Who's collecting the rent? What repairs do we need to make? And finally, we said, let's give this to a rental agency, let them manage it, and just cut us a check every month. And that made a huge difference in our meetings. We stopped being a building committee that happened to be a lodge and started being a lodge again. And that was really the secret sauce of getting out of the building management game, so we could concentrate on the membership experience and what we do best, and not do the building management piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So Seth, it's mentioned in your biography earlier that you're the curator of the Museum of Fezology. I was hoping maybe you could tell the brothers a little bit, or tell everybody a little bit about that. And we have Heather Calloway with us tonight too, who I would love, Heather, to get you to come on and do a presentation on your own at some point. But after Seth talks about Fezology, would you mind telling us about the Historical Society of American Fraternalism? I want to give you guys an opportunity to plug some other stuff.
Or plug. I'll make my plug as quick as I can, and then let Heather do her thing. So many years ago, in the mid 2000s, I was playing trivia at my local pub, and I started wearing fezzes as a funny thing. And then I started noticing that there were fezzes at the local flea market all the time. And it was a cheap thing to collect. I was poor and working for Tom LeBlanc at the Pennsylvania Masonic Youth Foundation, a great place to work, but it's nonprofit work as always. So it was a cheap thing to collect and have fun with. And I just started buying fezzes. And there's a much longer version of this story, but I ended up finding a fez that I didn't know what it was. I posted it on my website, and a fella called me and said, I'd like to tell you what this fez is. And he gave me the whole history of the fez and everything. And at the end, he said one of the most profound things I've ever heard in my life. I asked him, why did you take the time to call me and tell me about this silly hat? And he said, if I don't tell you about that silly hat, nobody else cares. Nobody else wants to hear about my silly hat. I spent my life with this organization wearing that silly hat, and it means the world to me. And nobody else has ever cared, but you cared. And every one of those silly hats, every one of those fezzes, every Scottish Rite hat you see at a flea market, a man wore that and was proud of that. And it ended up in a bin somewhere. And if we don't save that history and the stories of those men and women who have come before us, we're doomed to repeat it. And someday our hat and our past master jewel and all that's going to end up in a bin somewhere, and nobody's going to understand what it's from, or who we are. And that's why I'm motivated to do what I do. And Heather can tie that into the work we're doing at IU.
Yes. So certainly, the story of the Historical Society, obviously, most of you know, I worked for the Scottish Rite headquarters for the Southern jurisdiction, the House of the Temple, for 14 years, as museum curator and one of the librarians. And it was a dream job. It really, and the number one question I received all the time was, we're closing, we're moving, we're selling our stuff, we're selling our building. What do we do? What do we do with all our stuff? And, we couldn't take that stuff at the House of the Temple. They're talking about robes and swords and, all the stuff you have in a Scottish Rite wardrobe. So, I really I took that to heart, and I thought, well, what is going to happen to all these things? I went back to school and got my doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, and they actually let me write my dissertation about that. And so I did that. And at the same time, I was always going to these Masonic things, either selling books for the Research Society or, all these odd things as part of my job. And that I was doing that at Masonic Week. And after sitting at the booth all day, we would sit around and dream big about, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What do we want to do? And, Mark Tabert and myself had been talking for years, because he had the same job I had, but at the memorial. And so we were each other's like cheerleaders in various ways of like, he's saving these things and I'm trying to save these other things. And we're figuring what about all these other groups. And that's really what led us to start the Historical Society. Mark introduced me to Seth, and I was able to meet him and go to his installation. That's when we first met. And it just grew from there. And that was years ago. And we said, let's start a nonprofit. So the Historical Society was the start of the nonprofit to save all these other groups' history. In the meantime, I was eventually recruited to come to IU and take care of all the different collections they have here. We have 9 campuses around the state and over 250 different kinds of collections. So that is libraries, museums, archives, natural history collections, all kinds of stuff. But fraternal groups still remain my first love and my history research interest that I do all the time. And so Seth and myself and Mark, and then we have a few new people that have joined us over the years to save this other history. We met Ken Motor in Lafayette, Indiana, and he is a collector of Knights of Pythias stuff. And he got into that because he's a Mason and he's all these other groups too, but his big thing was Pythians. And so he started collecting these pins and jewels and hats, and he created a whole museum of that. And we met him, and our worlds just kind of converged. And then when we started to really realize we needed to fundraise, the best way to do that was to have a legitimate place and space that we could do that. And that's why IU. So as the Historical Society, we just couldn't, we couldn't ask, people weren't giving money to that. And so at IU, we work with the foundation. So it's a legit way that people can make a donation, as well as, work with the foundation to get a tax write-off, which is a plus. And we also have the storage for these things. So we have staff, I'm the only one here that does fraternal stuff right now, but we have places that these things can be safe And in the future, a database where people from home will be able to get online and see these old proceedings and minutes and things and do their research. Yes, we still want them to come here, but how we do research nowadays too is also online.
Heather, is there a website where you can see some of this collection, or is it strictly
Not yet.
an in-house thing? Okay.
Not yet. We're working on our database. I lost my IT guy a few months ago, so trying to replace him and get the database actually on there so people can play with it.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well,
Brothers, are there any other questions? I don't see really anything in chat. Anybody else?
Thanks for spending time with XLCR32. The experiences, comments, opinions, and views shared on this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, Concordant, or pendant body. Until we meet again, keep on reaching higher.
and Bob has been pushing for you. So if you see Bob, you might want to buy him a drink. Actually, Bob, you don't drink anymore, so you can buy me a drink. You can buy, Bob a nice ice cream.
Sarsaparilla.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Seth. Peter, do you want to take us out for the evening?
Thanks for spending time with XLCR32. The experiences, comments, opinions, and views shared on this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, Concordant, or pendant body. Until we meet again, keep on reaching higher.